Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 8th chapter of the 6th book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The text follows. We think now that in this way we have gone over and brought into view everything comprised in the province of the defensive. At the same time, there are subjects of sufficient importance in themselves to form separate chapters, that is, points for consideration in themselves, and these we must also study. For example, the nature and influence of fortified places, entrenched camps, defense of mountains and rivers, operations against the flank, etc. We shall treat of them in subsequent chapters, but none of these things lie outside of the preceding sequence of ideas. They are only to be regarded as a closer application of it to locality and circumstances. That order of ideas has been deduced from the conception of the defensive and from its relation to the offensive. We have connected these simple ideas with reality and therefore shown the way by which we may return again from the reality to those simple ideas and obtain firm ground, not to be forced in reasoning to take refuge on points of support which themselves vanish in the air. But resistance by the sword may wear such an altered appearance, assume such a different character through the multiplicity of ways of combining battles, especially in cases where these are not actually realized but become effectual merely through their possibility, that we might incline to the opinion that there must be some other efficient active principle still to be discovered. Between the sanguinary defeat in a simple battle and the effects of strategic combinations which do not bring the thing nearly so far as actual combat, there seems such a difference that it is necessary to suppose some fresh force, something in the same way as astronomers have decided on the existence of other planets from the great space between Mars and Jupiter. If the assailant finds the defender in a strong position which he thinks he cannot take, or behind a large river which he thinks he cannot cross, or even if he fears that by advancing further he will not be able to subsist his army, in all these cases it is nothing but the sword of the defensive which produces the effect. For it is the fear of being conquered by this sword, either in a great battle or at some especially important points, which compels the aggressor to stop. Only he will either not admit that at all, or does not admit it in a straightforward way. Now, even if it is granted that where there has been a decision without bloodshed, the combat merely offered, but not accepted, has been the ultimate cause of the decision, it will still be thought that in such cases the really effectual principle is the strategic combination of these combats, and not their tactical decision, and this superiority of the strategic combination could only have been thought of because there are other defensive means which may be considered, besides an actual appeal to the sword. We admit this, and it brings us just to the point we wish to arrive at, which is as follows. If the tactical result of a battle must be the foundation of all strategic combinations, and it is always possible and to be feared that the assailant may lay hold of this principle, and above all things direct his efforts to be superior in the hour of decision, in order to baffle the strategic combination. And that, therefore, this strategic combination can never be regarded as something all-sufficient in itself, that it only has a value when either on one ground or another we can look forward to the tactical solution without any misgivings. In order to make ourselves intelligible in a few words, we shall merely call to our readers' recollection how such a general as Bonaparte marched without hesitation through the whole web of his opponent's strategic plans to seek for the battle itself, because he had no doubts as to its issue. Where therefore strategy had not directed its whole effort to ensure a preponderance over him in this battle, where it engaged in finer, that is feebler plans, there it was rent asunder like a cobweb. But the general like down might be checked by such measures. It would therefore be folly to offer Bonaparte and his army what the Prussian army of 7 years' war dared to offer Daun and his contemporaries. Why? because Bonaparte knew right well that all depended on the tactical issue and made certain of gaining it, whereas with Daun it was very different in both respects. On this account we hold it therefore to be serviceable to show that every strategic combination rests only upon the tactical results, and that these are everywhere, in the blood as well as in the bloodless solution, the real fundamental grounds of the ultimate decision. It is only if we have no reason to fear that decision, whether on account of the character of the situation of the enemy, or on account of the moral and physical equality of the two armies, or on account of our own superiority, it is only then that we can expect something from strategic combinations in themselves without battles. Now, if a great many campaigns are to be found within the compass of military history, in which the assailant gives up the offensive without any blood being split in fight, in which therefore strategic combinations show themselves effectual to that degree, this may lead to the idea that these combinations have at least great inherent force in themselves, and might in general decide the affair alone, where too great a preponderance in the tactical result is not supposed on the side of the aggressor. To this we answer that if the question is about things which have their origin in the theatre of war and consequently belong to the war itself, the idea is also equally false, and we add that the cause of the failure of most attacks is to be found in the higher, the political relations of war. The general relations out of which a war springs and which naturally constitute its foundation determine also its character. On this subject we shall have more to say hereafter in treating of the plan of a war. But these general relations have converted most wars into half and half things, into which real hostility has to force its way through such a conflict of interests, that it is only a very weak element at the last. This effect must naturally show itself chiefly and with most force on the side of the offensive, the side of positive action. One cannot therefore wonder if such a short-winded consumptive attack is brought to a standstill by the touch of a finger, against a weak resolution so fettered by 1,000 considerations that it has hardly any existence. A mere show of resistance is often enough. It is not the number of unassailable positions in all directions, not the formidable look of the dark mountain masses encamped round the theatre of war, or the broad river which passes through it, not the ease with which certain combinations of battles can effectually paralyze the muscle which should strike the blow against us. None of these things are the true causes of the numerous successes which the defensive gains on bloodless fields. The cause lies in the weakness of the will with which the assailant puts forward his hesitating feet. These counteracting influences may and ought to be taken into consideration, but they should only be looked upon in their true light, and their effects should not be ascribed to other things, namely the things of which alone we are now treating. We must not omit to point out in an emphatic manner how easily military history in this respect may become a perpetual liar and deceiver, if criticism is not careful about taking a correct point of view. Let us consider in what way we may call their ordinary form the main offensive campaigns which have miscarried without a bloody solution. The assailant advances into the enemy's country, drives back his opponent a little way, but finds it too serious a matter to bring on a decisive battle. He therefore remains standing opposite to him, acts as if he had made a conquest, and had nothing else to do but to protect it, as if it was the enemy's business to seek the battle, as if he offered it to him daily, etc. These are the representations with which the commander deludes his army, his government, the world, even himself. But the truth is that he finds the enemy in a position too strong for him. We do not now speak of a case where an aggressor does not proceed with his attack because he can make no use of a victory, because at the end of his first bound he has not enough impulsive force left to begin another. Such a case supposes an attack which has been successful, a real conquest, but we have here in view the case where an assailant sticks fast halfway to his intended conquest. He is now waiting to take advantage of favorable circumstances, of which favorable circumstances there is in general no prospect, for the aggression now intended shows at once that there is no better prospect from the future than from the present. It is, therefore, a further illusion If now, as is commonly the case, the undertaking is in connection with other simultaneous operations, then what they do not want to do themselves is transferred to other shoulders, and their own inactivity is ascribed to want of support and proper cooperation. Insurmountable obstacles are talked of, and motives in justification are discovered in the most confused and subtle considerations. Thus the forces of the assailant are wasted away in inactivity, or rather in a partial activity destitute of any utility. The defensive gains time, the greatest gain to him. Bad weather arrives, and the aggression ends by the return of the aggressor to winter quarters in his own theatre of war. A tissue of false representations thus passes into history in place of the simple real ground of absence of any result, namely fear of the enemy's sword. When criticism takes up such a campaign, it wearies itself in the discussion of a number of motives and counter-motives, which give no satisfactory result because they all dwindle into vapor, and we have not descended to the real foundation of the truth. The opposition through which the elementary energy of war, and therefore to the offensive in particular, becomes weakened, lies for the most part in the relations and views of states, and these are always concealed from the world, from the mass of the people belonging to the state, as well as from the army, and very often from the general-in-chief. No one will account for his faint-heartedness by the admission that he feared he could not attain the desired object with the force at his disposal, or that new enemies would be roused, or that he did not wish to make his allies too powerful. Such things are hushed up. But as occurrences have to be placed before the world in a presentable form, therefore the commander is obliged, either on his own account or on that of his government, to pass off a tissue of fictitious motives. This ever-recurring deception in military dialectics has ossified into systems in theory, which of course are equally devoid of truth. Theory can never be deduced from the essence of things except by following the simple thread of cause and effect, as we have tried to. If we look at military history with this feeling of suspicion, then a great parade of mere words about offensive and defensive collapses, and the simple idea of it which we have given comes forward of itself. We believe it therefore to be applicable to the whole domain of the defensive, and that we must adhere closely to it in order to obtain that clear view of the mass of events by which alone we can form correct judgments. We have still to inquire into question of the employment of these different forms of defense. As they are merely gradations of the same which must be purchased by a higher sacrifice corresponding to the increased intensity of the form, there would seem to be sufficient in that view to indicate always to the general which he should choose, provided that there are no other circumstances which interfere. He would in fact choose that form which appeared sufficient to give his force the requisite degree of a defensive power, and no more, that there might be no unnecessary waste of his force. But we must not overlook the circumstance that the room given for choice amongst these different forms is generally very circumscribed, because other circumstances which must be attained to necessarily urge a preference for one or other of them. For a retreat into the interior of the country, a considerable superficial space is required, or such a condition of things as existed in Portugal, where one ally, England, gave support in rear, and another, Spain, with its wide territory, considerably diminished the impulsive force of the enemy. The position of the fortresses more on the frontier, more in the interior, may likewise decide for or against such a plan, but still more the nature of the country and ground, the character, habits, and feelings of the inhabitants. The choice between an offensive or defensive battle may be decided by the plans of the enemy, by the peculiar qualities of both armies and their generals. Lastly, the possession of an excellent position or line of defense, or the want of them, may determine for one or the other. In short, at the bare mention of these things, we can perceive that the choice of the form of defensive must, in many cases, be determined more by them than by the mere relative strength of the armies. As we shall hereafter enter more into detail on the more important subjects which have just been touched upon, the influence which they must have upon the choice will then develop itself more distinctly, and in the end the whole will be methodized in the book on plans of wars and campaigns. But this influence will not, in general, be decisive unless the inequality in the strength of the opposing armies is trifling. In the opposite case, as in the generality of cases, the relation of the numerical strength will be decisive. There is ample proof in military history that it has done so heretofore, and that without the chain of reasoning by which it has been brought out here. Therefore, in a manner intuitively, by mere tact of judgment, like most things that happen in war. It was the same general who, at the head of the same army and on the same theater of war, fought the battle of Hohenfriedberg, and at another time took the camp of Bunzelwitz. Therefore, even Frederick the Great, a general above all inclined to the offensive as regards to the battle, saw himself compelled at last by a great disproportion of force to resort to a real defensive position. And Bonaparte, who was once in the habit of falling on his enemy like a wild boar, have we not seen him, when the proportion of force turned against him in August and September 1813, turn himself hither and thither as if he had been pent up in a cage, instead of rushing forward recklessly upon some of his adversaries, and in October of the same year, when the disproportion reached its climax, have we not seen him at Leipzig, seeking shelter in the angle formed by the party Elster and the Place, as it were waiting for his enemy in the corner of a room, with his back against the wall? We cannot omit to observe that from this chapter, more than from any other in our book, it is plainly shown that our object is not to lay down new principles and methods of conducting war, but merely to investigate what has long existed in its innermost relations and to reduce it to its simplest elements. And very beautiful chapter indeed, that in fact today we concluded, because we split it in 3 videos as it's very long. And this last part, as you have listened, so the chapter is about the methods of resistance, and dedicated mostly to confirm the demonstration of the superiority of the defensive over the offensive. And here von Clausewitz essentially highlights several aspects. Actually, we can reduce them to these. First of all, we have the importance of properly the battle as in combat, the fight as the solver of war by itself, so that there is properly not a pregressed strategical situation. Von Clausewitz says that prevents victory without passing through at least the expectation of a fight, and we've seen how fundamentally this expectation, albeit immaterial, ideal, right, it's still a very important strategical quantity, right, that weighs on the fact the waging, on the conduct of war. Also, we have von Clausewitz returns on the importance of, of historical example by admonishing us that, of course, what we read here in the book, it's the theory of the art of war that takes into consideration essentially the intrinsic nature of military dynamics, we could say, and their own logics. That is, however, something mitigated constantly by the political control on the military instrument. It never ceases to suspend this. So fundamentally, von Clausewitz says, you don't have to look at wars that didn't come to a major clash, that weren't resolved by a fight, a bloodshed, because it's plenty of those, as politics may start a war but simply finish it before before it's finished from a properly military point of view, and therefore that is not a proof that wars are not solved properly by bloodshed. If we look at the military logic of them, and therefore we're talking strategy and tactics when a campaign properly militarily meant. Also, von Clausewitz observes how these let's say, and that's the beautiful conclusion of it, that explains the book in many ways, and that it, if the critics of von Clausewitz had even read the Vom Kriege, would be ashamed for their book, that this work is not a prescriptional one, right? It surely admonishes, it warns, it educates, it enlightens, etc. on the conduct of war. It shows us a positive theory of war, because what we read here can come to practice. But the way this is done, this is not by giving an information, let's say, a prescriptive information. It simply says, look what warfare has always been historically, right? So that also any other criticism, for example, based on the idea that, von Clausewitz was just talking about an early 19th century warfare, it's another thing that doesn't take into account that von Clausewitz is talking about consciously, explicitly, expressly about all warfare in time, and that therefore what he writes here is very relevant. It's always relevant to also naturally what happens today, right? Drones do not change the nature of warfare. It's a brutal, modernistic, technologistic, mechanistic misconception that mostly reveals the lack of strategical education that we have reached at this point after, having had, for example, just a work like this. I won't start my usual rant, but this chapter in the analysis of the intrinsic relations between the defensive and the offensive naturally shows us this constant, let's say, dynamic, this reciprocal action that we cannot lie to ourselves about, right? It's like the conduct of war here. An invader, from Clausewitz, says that at a certain point stops in front of the enemy that is defending and doesn't do anything there, is not doing it because there is a major, strange thing out there, it's the nature of the territory, it's whatever. It's fundamentally about the fact that he cannot gain that tactical superiority that would solve the problem. And this surely derives from the nature of the theater of war, as von Clausewitz makes clear in the end, but it reduces itself to effectively the fact that you cannot defeat an enemy in battle, or in the sum of clashes, of tactical units, as von Clausewitz call it. So these small encounters, small clashes that make eventually this strategical result, right? Which is obviously tied to lots of other things, but that by themselves and especially individually are not decisive, right? And when you're an invader that stops at the first difficulty, well, you have failed, because there is no properly, and that's a very important passage we will reread now. There is the one that says, nothing can block you but the enemy. And in a way, not even that, meaning that if you were determined enough, you would be able to crush the enemy. But you're not, because you're not willing to risk so much, because you think you're not strong enough. But the difference is really made by that, right? Ideally, yes, in a sense, but practically too, because what effectively wakes at that point of resisting, for example, and of you to overcome the same resistance is effectively how determined you are, and also how the enemy is, right? So not that, for example, the advantage of defensive there doesn't weigh, but once again, this is relative to your actual determination to go on with the struggle, not some other weird thing that you can eventually speculate or make relativism about when you have to explain why you haven't taken action in that specific campaign, while you were supposed to be defensive there. So von Clausewitz says, we think now that in this way we have gone over and brought into view everything comprised in the province of the defensive. At the same time, there are subjects of sufficient importance in themselves to form separate chapters, that is, points of consideration in themselves, and these we must also study. For example, the nature and the influence of fortified places, entrenched camps, defense of mountains and rivers, operations against the flanks, etc. We shall treat them in subsequent chapters, but none of these things lie outside of the preceding sequence of ideas. They are only to be regarded as a closer application of it locally to locality and circumstances. That is to say, as we were saying before, it's not, as we see here, the nature and influence of fortified places, entrenched camps, defense of mountains and rivers, operations against the flank that can solve positively the war by itself when, there's not enough determination from that side, when the relations of defense and attack are not properly fueled by a will, a motivation to go on, right? Those are things that are field of strategical value when you actually do feel them, but they're not intrinsic themselves, right? Everything is fluid, everything is unstable in this system, and especially unpredictable by the overwhelming majority. For Clausewitz writes, that order of ideas is being deduced from the conception of the defensive, and from its relation to the offensive, we have connected these simple ideas with reality, and therefore shown the way by which we may return again from the reality to those simple ideas and obtain firm ground, and not to be forced in reasoning to take refuge on points of support with themselves vanish in the air. So once again, it's not that these secondary elements are not important. They're what compose the picture, but they are instrumental fundamentally to the broader purpose, and therefore they will bring to a solution that depends on the way you are able to exploit them. So that, for example, intrinsic advantage of the defensive over the offensive, it is true in absolute terms when if we think of an absolute parity. Then in war, of course, that won't be reached, but still that specific dynamic is present. It's axiomatic. It presents itself with a, it's always constant, right? You just have to give it a value as a factor, and that value largely has to do with your determination. And not only, well, here I'm saying determination in the broader sense, like how what your moral sources broadly are, which is not just determination, but also intelligence and coup and all these elements that go all together with the capacity of command and the virtue of the army, as von Clausewitz says. So yes, but mostly it's about these moral, properly not morale, what I would like to understand, but properly moral forces all together, right? And so von Clausewitz says the force and reason itself vanish in the air, but resistance by the sword may wear such an altered appearance, assume such a different character through the multiplicity of ways of combining battles, as we're saying now, factors change, especially in cases where these are not actually realized, but become effectual merely through their possibility, that we might incline to the opinion that there must be some other efficient active principle still to be discovered. Between the sanguinary defeat in a simple battle and the effects of strategic combinations which do not bring to the thing nearly as so far as actual combat, there seems to be such a difference that it is necessary to suppose some fresh force, something in the same way as astronomers have decided on the existence of other planets from the great space between Mars and Jupiter. If the assailant finds the defender in a strong position which he thinks he cannot take, or behind a larger river which he thinks he cannot cross, or even if he fears that by advancing further he will not be able to subsist his army, in all these cases it is nothing but the sword of the defensive which produces the effect. For it is the fear of being conquered by this sword, either in a great battle or some special important points, which compels the aggressor to stop. Only the will either not admit that at all, or does not admit it in a straightforward way. So as we have seen already in the previously in the chapter, it's not, once again, the place that makes the thing. That can help, but if there is no resistance that is put up, the offensive at that point has a freeway, right? It can't consume, of course, resources, etc., but it won't have attacked if it thinks, he can't even cross the freaking place. And here we're talking about, the overwhelming majority of all military operations in history, right? Humans do know how to fight pretty well. And they don't do it especially for, recklessly, as it's commonly believed, as if war was irrational, but it's actually stems from some of the most rational, well, at least in the way it's waged, right? in the most practical, rational ways that you can think. So you don't take that action usually if there is nothing to gain there. And Clausewitz says, for it is the fear of being conquered by the sword, as we've seen, either in great battle, some specially important points which compels the aggressor to stop. Right? Then he can admit it, not admit it, but the point is still that if you are invading and you're stopped, it's because you fear that you're going to be crushed in combat by the enemy. There's no other way around that. It's not the territory, it's not the thing. And that's an interesting way of seeing it, because it reveals you how even, geopolitical instances and so on fundamentally do not make sense, right? It's always about the political and military capacity of the enemy to say, okay, you know what, and the social one as well, because it's all together, that says, I will stop you here. And you have to just, to go against him at that point if you want to make the difference. And there is no other way around the story. So a defeat is a defeat in that regard. There is nothing you can do to conceal it in practice. So it's that simple from a military point of view. And von Clausewitz says, now, even if it is granted that where there has been a decision without bloodshed, the combat merely offered but not accepted has been the ultimate cause of the decision, it will still be thought that in such cases the really effectual principle is the strategic combination of these combats and not their tactical decision, and that this superiority of the strategic combination could only have been thought of because there are other defensive means which may be considered besides an actual appeal to the sword. We admit this, and it brings us just to the point we wish to arrive at, which is as follows. If the tactical result of a battle must be the foundation of all strategic combinations, then it is always possible and to be feared that the assailant may lay hold of this principle and above all things direct his efforts to be superior in the hour of decision in order to baffle the strategical combination, and that this strategic combination can never be regarded as something all-sufficient in itself, that it only has a value when either one ground or another we can look forward to the tactical solution without any misgivings. There is no way around that. In other words, there is no determinism in this. There is no war that is fought, even one of the most unbalanced odds in which one of the two had to, which the outcome was already decided before. It doesn't exist, right? And the more you approach the outrage, which is mostly what normally reality approaches, you realize that the odds are balanced, and that the reasons why countries fight are always because victory is possible, is at hand, and also the ways that this can be achieved are way more, are built along the way, or not just, progress situation that of course is important, but it's never deterministically to be won or lost simply because of pre-existing strategical condition. That is, it's always possible to be defeated, even if the odds are dramatically in your favor. It's always possible to win, even if the odds are dramatically against you, right? And no strategical reality has a meaning if it's not aimed at the tactical engagement, right? They're always intertwined. You don't win with strategy. You win through tactics, right? And there is this is important, right? Not that strategy is not important, but strategy, it's just the preparation of the means of combat. For that specific combat, everything narrows down to that fight, right? It doesn't matter if it's a fight of guerrilla that is scattered all over a huge territory, thousands of clashes, or if it's a single massive battle that basically puts an end to most. It's always gonna pass through the fight, right? There is not an intrinsic strategic condition from which you can simply say, okay, we made it, we're easy, we're fine, right? Also because the enemy, if he acts, it's because he knows he has a way. He won't get himself killed, right? And wars are not fought in that sense exactly because what would be the point of fighting them if you think that the odds are you simply give up. So that's the important thing though, because that reveals how much you're willing to fight or win. And that's that determination that makes the push in most cases. And believe me, it's not a mechanical thing. It's dramatically fluid. It's dramatically unstable and dynamic. You can have the best armies, the best commanders, the best logistics, whatever. You will fail anyway, sometimes. And there is, and this is not a popular thought, because people like to make sense positivistically, deterministically, teleologically of reality. Reality doesn't give a damn about these delusions. Reality goes on, and people like these get passed by, and very often are the ones that get defeated. Exactly because they don't see the point. They don't see. It's a matter of laziness in a sense, right? He who has the greatest motive, the greatest will find the best solutions in relative terms. There is no way out of that. And especially the one with disadvantage. That's the force that rebalances the thing most of the cases, because if you think you have a dramatic advantage, you will lower the guard in a way, and the enemy will capitalize upon it. And most of the times, that balance is never so, strained. I mean, the odds are, as we've seen, basically always balanced for you to not to, let's say, justify a lowering of the guard at basically at any level, because that's how many, it's really, there are infinite possibilities to be exploited in a sense. Infinite things that can be produced in reality based on a decision, on an action that will make the difference. That's why it's so empowering, because it really shows you the responsibility that you individually have literally in everything you can do, not just in war but in life. Von Clausewitz says, in order to make ourselves intelligible in a few words, we shall merely call to our readers' recollection of how such a general as Bonaparte marched without hesitation through the whole web of his opponent's strategic plans to seek for the battle itself, because he had no doubts as to its issue. He was sure of that. He was going for it, because it doesn't matter how difficult the thing was getting. Think about the campaign of Austerlitz, right? Aside from initially with Ulm, etc., but how deep he advanced into enemy territory to get that battle. Well, aside from the broader masterpiece of the Drake, of the choice of that ground, etc., the show of the appearance, the faking, all the all the art that he deployed there, but specifically, he wanted that victory because he was confident he would gain that. Through what? Through the fight, which is the only possible way. The others were just like, aside from the problems, coordination, right? They had different calendars, they didn't even agree on the same speeds, dates, whatever. But the measures, all the stuff. But the point was, I keep advancing because I know I can. Right, and of course he was losing in part, so still strategy makes that, but still that loss happens through some kind of fight, some kind of harassment from the side of the enemies, etc. It doesn't pass through simply leaving space to the enemy without doing nothing proper, right? It's always about the fight that makes the difference. It's like the 1812 Russian campaign. The French were not defeated by winter, they were defeated by the Russians. Doesn't matter how clumsy saying Tsarists were, but practically that's what killed. In the sense that even when the French were put in conditions to literally starve to death, there's all this, to freeze to death and all this stuff, it was because they were prevented by the Russian army, because otherwise they would have not suffered like that. And that's the whole point of war. So it's very easy to deterministically say bullshit like, Russia cannot be invaded. Let's leave aside the Mongols that literally invaded it in winter and crushed it. But let's simply realize that things are always feasible, and that all this stuff will be ever clearer when the concept of a Schwerpunkt comes in, because that's where really the key is solved, because that really shows you what it takes to actually defeat an enemy, independently from the situation, right? And not that you will be able to do it positivistically, but at least there is always a way to identify what it should be exploited in order to defeat an enemy. What's literally going to to make it all center full, and it's very center full. But wherever, it's a subtle concept. We'll have to make some extra videos also aside from the commentaries of the Vom Kriege here. But von Clausewitz says, where therefore strategy had not directed its whole effort to ensure a preponderance over him in this battle, so we're talking about Napoleon's eagerness to battle, where it engaged in finer, that is, feebler plans, there it was rent asunder like a cobweb. But a general letdown might be checked by such measure. It would therefore be folly to offer Bonaparte and his army that the Prussian army of 7 years' war dared to offer down, and his contemporaries. Why? Because Bonaparte knew right well that all depended on the tactical issue and made certain of gaining it, whereas with Daun it was very different in both respects. Why though? And now we explain the political side of the story. On this account we hold it, because of course there were different strategies, but there were also different policies. On this account we hold it therefore to be serviceable to show that every strategic combination rests only upon the tactical results, and that these are everywhere, in the bloody as well as in the bloodless solution, the real fundamental grounds of the ultimate decision. It's only if we have no reason to fear that decision, whether on account of the character or the situation of the enemy, or on account of the moral and physical equality of the two armies, or on account of our own superiority, it is only then that we can expect something from strategic combinations in themselves without battles. Now, if a great many campaigns are to be found within the compass of military history in which the assailant gives up the offensive without any blood being spilt in fight, in which therefore strategic combinations show themselves effectual to that degree, this may lead to the idea that these combinations have at least great inherent force in themselves, and might in general decide the affair alone, where too great a preponderance in the tactical results is not supposed on the side of the aggressor. To this, we answer that if the question is about things which have their origin in the theater of war and consequently belong to the war itself, this idea is also equally false. And we add that the cause of the failure of most attacks is to be found in the higher, the political relations of war. This is crucial, right? Up to now, von Clausewitz showed us that the military logic brings to the undisputable evidence that there is no strategy without combat, without a fight. And that if so many wars, so many campaigns actually are stopped in the middle of them, this is not because somebody gave up because of the strategical problem that wouldn't lead to the tactical solution, but because there was not enough will to go on with the fight. For political reasons, for social reasons, right? This is the Clausewitzian trinity. That is, what does this mean? It means, of course, that you may have any reason to stop a war at some point, right? It has nothing to do with how things are progressing on the ground. I don't know, think about the Algerian War. The French were winning on the field. But, if they had kept on fighting, there would have been a revolution in France, and therefore de Gaulle took the French out. But this has nothing to do with the strategical and tactical accomplishments that the French were undergoing from a strictly military point of view in Algeria, right? The same goes with, the Vietnam War, right? The Americans won all battles of the Vietnam War, but they eventually bailed out. Why? There was a political opinion there, right? It was American politics, and more because this naturally was connected with the World War. But the important there is that we cannot read real wars if we believe that wars by themselves are a sort of undisputable match that two sides say, okay, let's see how it ends, like as if it were a laboratory situation. We are fighting because somebody decides to do something that at some point may not be interested in doing anymore, right? And therefore it stops the thing. How many things in your life you have started and you have finished not because there was no way of finishing them, but because you simply were tired. That's exactly what happens in reality, right? And we're not talking about a tiredness that is to say, I spent all my forces. That never happens. It's because you're lazy or demotivated, whatever. The same goes with war, identically, right? So This doesn't speak, let's say a bloodless solution or an incomplete solution, whatever, doesn't speak for the fact that something could not be won. I listen to many, and I have a huge respect for, anyway, many Vietnam veterans interviews, right? And what struck me is that of all these people, were mostly simple people. They were average privates, etc. Most of the times. I mean, they were privates on average. They were also officers, etc. But the idea is that none of them, I mean, people who had gone there to fight and die, and that lost their youth there, that their life was changed. There are also positive stories, telling you the truth. But not even one said that war could be won. There was a unanimous opinion from the side of people that also evidently, yes, had fought that war, but had practically not even, known what that was about. I mean, historically, politically, strategically, they, their knowledge about that war was extremely limited. From their own, field perspective, that, as always, has absolutely nothing to do with understanding what the war really is in that sense. Here we're not talking about emotionalistic readings of war, that is what we are feeding like a drug all our youth about. That is utterly disgusting in my opinion. But here we're talking about properly, as citizens are in that case of the United States, can be any other country, to say, okay, that war could not be won by the foe. It's like shutting your prefrontal cortex and saying, I don't want to hear anything about that. Let's speak naturally of the trauma that existed in American, in the United States, broadly meant. I mean, at all levels, right? Not just because these veterans were many. There are many people today that properly believe that the Vietnam War could not be won. This is an asinine mistake for whoever states that. The Vietnam War could be won like any other war, and it wasn't, winning it would have not been even such an overly difficult or complicated thing as it may seem. Certain things there strategically were completely, screwed up since the beginning. It could have gone completely another course. But no, there are people who deterministically say, no, that war, they're hysterical, right? They say, no, it could not be won. They have to convince themselves that for some reason it could not be won, so that they can justify the failure, maybe in a sense. And it's very limiting, because it means that the knowledge of that war is properly not being assimilated, right? The trauma has been, but the actual understanding not. And this is very, very serious, because it means you're just emotionally sensitive and, intelligently speaking, not really much. And I'm not talking here specifically of the United States. Here, it's a sort of attitude that exists all over the world, because the Westerners are a bit obsessed by this idea that the guerrilla cannot be won, which history proves completely otherwise. And also in the rest of the world, there is a completely emotionalistic attitude to war that is, even worse. But it's a serious problem. Von Clausewitz laid it out by telling you simply, study military history. You will discover this is not quite the case, right? That war has a logic, a nature, a dynamic that you cannot, that is open to every solution. That what makes the difference is what you actually do, because war is so complicated that you cannot pretend you enter in one just to win. If you think like that, you're strategically uneducated. You don't know what war is in practice. And therefore, and this doesn't justify any, misreading of history. That is also a misreading of actual, historical, reality, to say the least. Then von Clausewitz says, the general relations out of which a war springs, and which naturally constitute its foundation, determine also its character. On this subject we shall have more to say hereafter in treating of the plan of a war, but these general relations have converted most wars into half-and-half things, into which real hostility has to force its way through such a conflict of interests, that it is only a very weak element at the last. So even at the point that the military instrument, as it often is in the world, look at now, right, we do engage in massive scale No. Why? Because there is no motivation, right? So war is, in this sense, simply adapting to the political. I mean, war is not even adapting. It's a tool of political action. Nothing else. War in itself does not exist as an agent, right? It's politics and society that make it, right? Altogether, and it's normal that in war, Ludwig would say this idea of a higher, lower intensity of warfare, which is also relatively misleading but it does render the idea in as much as, what's the difference between I don't know, a revolt in northern Gaul in 50 BC and I don't know, the Eastern Front in World War II, right? There is a massive scale of motivation to not even, I mean, in the actual outcome, of course, the war change, etc. Maybe, I don't know, those northern Gauls were maybe way more motivated than the average Soviet trooper. Who knows? But the question there is not that the Soviets were not motivated, contrarily to some popular stereotype, but the question there is, there are simply different. I mean, there is not a single war that is even remotely similar to another, right? That everything is completely different, and the reason why we don't focus that is because we focus just on the war in itself. That is, it's as if we formed a person in which we say, okay, this is just war, and it's like a video game. I set these battle conditions, and I play it and see who wins or not. That's not reality. That's a video game. Reality is that somebody has an intention and decides to use violence at some point, together with a lot of other things. I don't know if you ever used violence in your life, but at that point, what matters is not the use of violence in itself, but all what revolves around it, as a cause, as a consequence of what's going to impact it. That's how powerful war is, and that's also, however, how empty it is of itself, and how loaded and fueled by lots of other things that have nothing to do with war in itself. Right, this is the sap of the Clausewitzian theory, and it's dramatically realistic because reality. Basically, every social science confirms it, even if people do not study from Clausewitz. But it's factually so. Think about it. So naturally, von Clausewitz is for the idea that if you have to fight a war, it has to be fought with the necessary degree of motivation. But at the same time, he's the one that says, okay, but what is necessary in here? That's just determined by the interest, the motive, the objective. What are you doing it for? So von Clausewitz is not saying, here there would be a digression to make, because naturally von Clausewitz says, okay, it should be done with the greatest effort if you decide to do it. That is, you have to end it quickly, because the more it goes on, and the more damage in absolute terms it causes, which you could have spared. This is kind of a controversial idea, because to some it may seem, well, okay, the more violently you fight it, and therefore the most destructive it should be. Well, the idea is that it's a bit like nuclear weapons today. War has been frozen, factually, from whenever we have introduced them. Why? Because we have said, okay, if you dare do something like that, it will wipe you out. And this brought to, paradoxically, the necessity of not fighting a war. Right, it couldn't deterministically freeze everything, of course, but still, we call it Cold War for a reason. And regarding to action, von Clausewitz says, in fact, this effect must naturally show itself chiefly and with most force on the side of the offensive, the side of positive action, as we've seen in the course of the Vom Kriege, and especially this chapter again. One cannot therefore wonder if such a short-winded consumptive attack is brought to a standstill by the touch of a finger. Against a weak resolution so fettered by 1,000 considerations that it is hardly any existence, a mere show of resistance is often enough. It's not, yes, and it's, so as you understand, there is a reciprocal action, right? So defensive plays accordingly, right? It's not that defensive has an intrinsic advantage for which it wins all the time, or that it's such a dramatic advantage that, it can't go, without hands on wheel. It must always respond to this. And as we have seen, generally speaking, the attacker has the greatest motive. the first place, as von Clausewitz says provocatorily, the attacker is the greater lover of peace out of the two, because the defensive is just, laying there hoping actually to protract the fight, because that works at its advantage, right? So it's more destructive. The defensive requires more blood than the attacker, temperamentally, right? By the choice, that not because whoever defends is bloodier than the attacker, but culturally or whatever, but because properly that's the aim of the defense as such. And von Clausewitz says, it is not the number of unassailable positions in all directions, not the formidable look of the dark mountain masses encamped around the theater of war, or the broad river which passes through it, not the ease with which certain combinations of battles can effectively paralyze the muscle which should strike the blow against us. None of these things are the true cases of the numerous successes which the defensive gains on bloodless fields. The case lies in the weakness of the will with which the assailant puts forward his hesitating feet. This is deeply important as a phrase, because it makes you understand how far any strategical consideration is subject to failure potentially, right? The more you're motivated, the greater the will, and the more the strategy has to adapt in ways that are ever more complex, right? Because the defensive doesn't have a pre-packed strategy. It has to make this thing work, and it's expensive, and it costs, and it must have a point here. So, the fact that it's not, in fact, in practice, always more, let's say, easier than the attack. On the contrary, whoever attacks usually should have this more. It's the part of the lion in that regard. So that, because they know they have to basically surpass the difficulty, the disadvantage posed by their form of war. And then von Clausewitz says, these counteracting influences may and ought to be taken into consideration, but they should only be looked upon in their true light, and their effects should not be ascribed to other things, namely the things of which alone we are now treating. We must not omit to point out in an emphatic manner how easily military history in this respect may become a perpetual liar and deceiver if criticism is not careful about taking a correct point of view. So, as we were saying before, do not judge military history just because you think it's pure. What happens in the field is purely military. Most of the time, it's always purely political, right? It just depends on how much politics wants to leave to the military. And then he says, let us now consider in what we may call their ordinary form the many offensive campaigns which have miscarried without a bloody solution. The assailant advances into the enemy's country, drives back his opponent a little way, but finds it too serious a matter to bring on a decisive battle. He therefore remains standing opposite to him, acts as if he had made a conquest and had nothing else to do but to protect it, as if it was the enemy's business to seek the battle, as if he offered to him daily, etc. These are the representations with which the commander deludes his army, his government, the world, even himself, right? So it's all excuses. But the truth is that he finds the enemy in a position too strong for him, and there is no way around that. We do not now speak of a case where an aggressor does not proceed with his attack because he can make no use of a victory, because at the end of his first bound he has not enough impulsive force left to begin another. Such a case supposes an attack which has been successful, a real conquest, but we have here in view the case where an assailant sticks fast halfway to his intended conquest. Right, you want an objective, you reach it, maybe you don't have much force to go on. Okay, we understand that, but you reached that objective. Instead, if you went for it and you stop halfway, the question is something went dramatically wrong, and in war, that's because the enemy has put up a resistance that you evidently didn't expect to cope and that you are not willing to cope with in a way or another. Not even that you can't, but you're not willing to, which is a different thing, and that reveals you how important moral forces are to war in practice, how it's really a matter of will, it's really a matter of motivation. Then von Clausewitz says, He's now waiting to take advantage of the attacker, of favorable circumstances, which favorable circumstances there is, in general, no prospect for the aggression now intended, shows at once that there is no better prospect from the future than from the present. You can't say in war, well, but if the enemy wasn't in the middle, I would achieve that, because it doesn't make sense. What do you think a war is? There is a freaking enemy, and that's the one you have to defeat. It's not... The enemy is not passed behind itself. It's there, and it's standing there, and if you can't progress in the campaign, you can't say, well, but I planned it. Yes, you planned, but it didn't work as planned. Welcome to reality, right? And adapt to it. Find a solution, because you can always find one, right? You will know absolutely no way to say whether it will work or not, but you can do better, always. Von Clausewitz writes, it is therefore a further illusion, if now, as is commonly the case, the undertaking is in connection with other simultaneous operations, then what they do not want to do themselves is transferred to other shoulders, and their own inactivity is ascribed to want of support and proper cooperation. Insurmountable obstacles are talked of, and motives in justification are discovered in the most confused and subtle considerations. Thus, the forces of the assailant are wasted away in inactivity, or rather in a partial activity, destitute of any utility. The offensive gains time, the greatest gain to him. Bad weather arrives, and the aggression ends by the return of the aggressor to winter quarters in his own theatre of war. A tissue of false representations thus passes into history in the place of simple real ground of absence of any result, namely the fear of the enemy's sword. There's not much way around a general's account that wants to stress how, it was the weather, man. If it hadn't been for the weather, it would have defeated. The weather doesn't defeat you. Or better, if the enemy can cope with it and you can't, there is something there even more seriously that you haven't taken into consideration for fighting in that place. But the point is that whoever does go into, even an environmentally, terrible place just to, let's say, okay, well, no, I go back. Your war is not usually even fought in places that do not provide kind of, let's say, we have seen how what happens normally in war is fighting. The most important strategical results arrive in places that are more strategically relevant. So fighting, in areas that also have such terrible ground for which, it's usually for the enemy as well. Those are not super mentors, are not, maybe better supplied, etc. But then why did you go at war with them if there is such an asymmetry that can bring you down in that way? In any case, you would probably, their resistance is what stops you. It's not the weather in itself. But the fear of the enemy is a sword, and there is no way around that. Right, if you don't progress, it's because somebody is blocking you, and somebody is blocking you. So there is a somebody there, and that somebody is against you, and is fighting against you, is hurting you, is killing you. And you can't say, okay, well, that's not important. Right, men are way more devastating than lots of things that happen randomly in the world. And they do it in a much more aimed, precise, surgical, clever, and striking way. And all the history of warfare is this increasing specialization in finding ways to put the enemy in condition of inferiority, striking him from your own superiority, conversely speaking. And von Clausewitz says, when criticism takes up such a campaign, it wears itself in the discussion of a number of motives and counter-motives which give no satisfactory result because they all dwindle into vapor, and we have not descended to the real foundation of the truth. The opposition through which the elementary energy of war, and therefore of the offensive in particular, becomes weakened, lies for the most part in the relations of states, and these are always concealed from the world, from the mass of the people belonging to the state, as well as from the army, and very often from the general-in-chief. Welcome to politics. That dominates all this. Even here there would be huge digressions to do, because von Clausewitz says the commander-in-chief must be a bit politician as well, so he must know how much he can ask politics for his efforts if he is motivated, and even there is a political motivation for what he's doing himself at that point autonomously through the field, through the military instrument. But that's usually the point. We mostly, wars are fought in ways that are not usually paraded. I mean, banally. I don't know if you watch follow the news regularly on, I don't know, recently when the last days the Russians retreated against troops from the Ukrainian border. There were some clashes in days before. The media do not quite talk about this. Also, we know this because of broader information that comes from from journalism, from stuff we know, because if somebody moves, brigades move, it's not a secret, right? You can track them, right? It's a myth to say that there's dramatic strategic surprise, but these movements are trackable easily because they're macroscopic. Everybody knows that. But the reasons, what's behind them, what they're being told, what's the military mandate there, it's not known, right? That is classified. Maybe after 50 years, archives are open. We read that, but in practice, we don't know what's the plot behind that, right? We can read it, and that's all we study military history for, because we don't know most, what people said to themselves in command or their subordinates. We don't know, but we can study it easily from how the operation takes place in a way. So that is what mostly seems to be lacking to somebody who says, war was launched, so therefore it was easy to know what they were there for. But not really, because somebody had sent them there, and the reason why they had sent them, the necessity, the contingency, whatever, is usually not known, right? So, the larger the conflict and the more evident the motivations, in a way, but especially for smaller operations, well, it's a different thing, right? And in that regard, it's also, therefore, the fact that you don't see the political motivation shouldn't, however, make you write history as if, that didn't exist. There are troops that, I don't know, to declare war on Finland, that the Soviets shot with artillery on their own troops, for example. What's the military sense of that? Known. What's the political sense of it? A lot of sense, right? And that tells you how sacrificable people are, even in front of such big reasons. Then von Clausewitz says, no one will account for his faint-heartedness by the admission of the offender here, the offensive, by the admission that he feared he could not attain the desired object with the force at his disposal, or that new enemies would be aroused, or that he did not wish to make his allies too powerful, etc. Such things are hushed up. But as occurrences have to be placed before the world in a presentable form, therefore the commander is obliged, either on his own account or on that of his government, to pass off a tissue of fictitious motives. This ever-recurring deception in military dialectics has ossified into systems of theory, which, of course, are equally devoid of truth. Theory can never be deduced from the essence of things except by following the simple thread of cause and effect, as we have tried to do. And this has to do with the historical method, and we already talked about that. It's just a very, ideal thing in a way to do, because history mostly doesn't even provide us with the information, but still we can track through military logic some of this process in part. But not only, right? You can't study war just by studying war. You have to study politics, you have to study society as well, because otherwise you may miss the bigger picture. That's why, for example, we were saying before, the bigger picture of wars, like, I don't know, we made examples of Algeria or Vietnam. Because if you study the military history of it, and without the political one, you get the thing completely distorted in a sense, or at least you shouldn't. If you actually look, in fact, how what happens from a military point of view is often, let's say, different from eventually what politics decides it has to be, right? Even though it's politics that had decided before, but politics follows other logic than the military ones, right? So that's this mismatch, but they're actually part of the same thing, so it doesn't make sense to isolate the two. It's a mistake, actually. And von Clausewitz says, if we look at military history with this feeling of suspicion, then a great parade of mere words about offensive and defensive collapses, and the simple idea of it, which we have given, comes forward of itself. We should be suspicious, right? This is the curiosity of the historian, also military story, right? We can't elaborate too much. Good military studies are pretty concise, because what you can prove is there. The rest is just too much talking, right? You have to be very concrete. And the relation between defensive and offensive here, the more we get rid of that, represents itself, emerges, right? It's concrete, it's real. And it's always confirmed, by the way. So von Clausewitz says, we believe it therefore to be applicable to the whole domain of the defensive, and that we must adhere closely to it in order to obtain that clear view of the mass of events by which alone we can form correct judgments. And we have still to inquire into the question of the employment of these different form of defense, but whatever. Then von Clausewitz says, as they are merely gradations of the same which must be purchased by higher sacrifice corresponding to the increased intensity of the form, there would seem to be sufficient in that view to indicate always to the general which he should choose, provided there are no other circumstances which interfere. He would, in fact, choose that form which appeared sufficient to give his force the requisite degree of defensive power, and no more, that there might be no unnecessary waste of his force. Because reality naturally presents us with these degrees, and in reality they have a cost, and you have to understand there how much you're willing to invest, and why, in fact, sometimes even there are these shortcomings, like where you're stopped. But it happens all the time, right? Plans always present you with difficulties you have to solve step by step. But we must not overlook the circumstance that the room given for choice amongst these different forms is generally very circumscribed, because other circumstances which must be attended to necessarily urge a preference for one or other of them. For our retreat into the interior of the country, a considerable superficial space is required, or such a condition of things as existed in Portugal in 1810, where one ally, England, gave support in rear, and another, Spain, with its wide territory, considerably diminished the impulsive force of the enemy. The position of the fortresses more on the frontier, more in the interior, may likewise decide for or against such a plan. So, of course, plans are decided sometimes on the basis of something that is smaller, but that's, let's say, an operational issue, right? It doesn't, it's way more important why you are there in the first place and what makes it done, and what makes you willing to even be thinking of such ways of modes of action, right? And in fact, von Clausewitz lists are important things, but still more the nature of the country and ground, the character, habits, and feelings of the inhabitants, for example. So that it's never just military thing; it's also political. That is, what about the people of the country you're fighting in? You should check out, so something tells us. And the choice between an unoffensive or defensive battle, von Clausewitz says, may be decided by the plans of the enemy as well. Of course, there are laws of reciprocity that we have seen. We don't do anything that is not meant to have an effect on a reacting living being like the enemy, nor anything we do that doesn't have to do with the enemy response to it, and it's constant, right? Or not properly two different times, before and after, which this happens. It's always the present that works like that. What is the enemy doing? We're fighting to defeat the enemy. We have to compel this guy to fulfill our will. So how will we do it, right? We have to check him first and foremost. Von Clausewitz says, by the peculiar qualities of both armies and their generals too, lastly, the possession of an excellent position or line of defense, or the want of them, may determine for one or the other, right? So a lot of factors that interplay, a lot of combinations, and that go in turn also by degrees of the intensity of the other factors that compose them. So an infinite picture, something you cannot pre-plan fully, right? You have to get the essentials, you have to be concise, you have to make a synthesis and hope it works, right? And generally speaking, human brain is designed to have this synthesis capacity. Von Clausewitz says, in short, at the bare mention of these things, we can perceive that the choice of the form of defensive must in many cases be determined more by them than by the mere relative strength of the armies. As we shall hereafter enter more into detail on the more important subjects which have just been touched upon, the influence which they must have upon the choice will then develop itself more distinctly, and in the end the whole will be methodized in the book of plans of wars and campaigns. But this influence will not in general be decisive, unless the inequality in the strength of the opposing armies is trifling, right? In the opposite case, as in the generality of cases, the relation of the numerical strength will be decisive, because we have seen that numbers, yes, you can't say, as we were saying in the beginning, that, yes, everything can be changed. Yes, there is a worst that can realistically achieved at some level, but how plausible is that, and how much are you willing to risk in that regard? If you're a million against one, right, at that point in practical reality you can think of the worst can happen to the million, but quite likely the one is going to be defeated. So we have to be realistic, concrete about that. But given that the odds are usually not that disproportionate, let's say, there is too much room for implementing, for not taking that. Well, it depends on the war, right? The fact that a war exists in the first place is because the odds are kind of okay to try most of the times. And in a properly practical level that is not decided by this dramatically sophisticated understanding, but simply by the nature of things, right? Their wars are something difficult to do, but they're fundamentally simple in nature, right? Clausewitz says there is ample proof in military history that it has done so heretofore, and that without the chain of reasoning by which it has been brought out here, therefore in a manner intuitively by mere tact of judgment, in fact, like most things that happen in war, as we were just saying. It's not a matter of sophisticated thinking. It's simply saying, okay, two states go at war, what are the odds? Like, let's look at the forces, let's look at what it can do. You can understand that, and what's the motivation? What is that fuels that well? That is also important. What's the commanding ability? It's a set of things that strategical analysts study, and that are complex indeed, and that military historians do too historically. Von Clausewitz says it was the same general what the head of the same army on the same theater of war fought the battle of Hohenfriedberg, and at another time took up the camp at Bunzelwitz. Therefore, even Frederick the Great, a general above all inclined to the offensive as regards the battle, saw himself like a wild boar. Have we not seen him when the proportion of force turned against him in August and September 1813, turn himself hither and thither as if he had been pent up in a cage, instead of rushing forward recklessly upon some one of his adversaries. And in October the same year, when the disproportion reached its climax, have we not seen him at Leipzig, seeking shelter in the angle formed by the part the Elster implies, and as if it were waiting for his enemy in the corner of a room, with his back against the wall? So that's obviously a condition that every commander finds himself in, right? Even in the greatest of endeavors. Serious ones. So von Clausewitz concludes by saying we cannot omit to observe that from this chapter, more than from any other in our book, pay attention, it is plainly shown that our object is not to lay down new principles and methods of conducting war, but merely to investigate what has long existed in its innermost relations, and to reduce it to its simplest elements. This is probably one of the single most important phrases of the Vom Kriege. I will repeat it. Our object is not to lay down new principles and methods of conducting war, but merely to investigate what has long existed in its innermost relations, and to reduce it to its simplest elements. We could comment 16 hours on this phrase, because it's literally what the Vom Kriege is about, right? We are not trying to say, okay, you go at war and you do this and that. Of course, you should consider this and that, because look what happened in reality, and that's the point. But not, you're completely without any any other purpose, let's say, than the one you find yourself in practically. And this is something that apparently is too difficult to understand for many people, and that I don't know what is wrong with it, but whatever. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.